The echo of a gunshot was the last thing Tessa Kingston heard before the world dissolved into a blur of dust and fear. She ran. Her boots pounded the dry earth of Redemption Creek, kicking up grit that coated her throat. The torn shawl clutched in her fist was the only thing she had left of a life she'd built over 3 quiet months. 3 months of peace, of honest work as a seamstress. 3 months before her past finally caught up. It always did. Whispers had followed her into town, sticking to her like cockleburs. Now, those whispers had become a roar. The banker's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, was at the head of the mob, and she wanted Tessa gone by sundown. Or strung up, whichever came first. Tessa darted between the general store and the blacksmith's forge, the clang of the hammer drowned out by the blood pounding in her ears. The afternoon sun was a merciless eye in the sky, stretching shadows across the street like grasping fingers. She was looking for a sanctuary, but she knew there wasn't one. Not for her. Not anymore. There she is. The shriek cut through the air. Tessa ducked deeper into an alley, the rough-hewn wood of the walls scraping her shoulders. The sound of their boots grew louder, a hungry, stomping rhythm. They were calling for justice. But what they wanted wasn't justice. It was a sacrifice. They wanted justice for the woman who'd once ridden with the notorious Blackwell gang. What they didn't know, what the wanted poster didn't say, was that she'd been a girl of 18, starving and alone after a fever took her parents. Jake Blackwell hadn't offered her a choice. He'd offered her bread. And when you're starving, you don't ask what it costs. What they didn't care about was that she'd been the one to burn it all down. She was the one who testified, the one who put that whole crew behind bars or in the ground. She was the one who had spent every day of the last 2 years trying to outrun the ghost of the girl she used to be. She reached the end of the alley, and her heart stopped. They had her. The mob had circled around, a wall of grim faces and loaded rifles blocking her only escape. Mrs. Holloway stood at the front, her lips pulled back in a righteous sneer. "We don't harbor criminals in Redemption Creek," she announced, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "Especially not women who forget their proper place." Tessa forced her spine straight. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "I've paid for my mistakes. I'm not that person anymore." "Once fallen, forever damned," Mrs. Holloway spat. "Your kind doesn't change." A big man shoved his way to the front, a thick length of rope coiled in his hand. "Let's make sure she can't steal nothing else before the marshal gets here." He was coming for her. Tessa pressed herself against the wall, her breath trapped in her chest. She'd been in tight spots before, but this was different. This was the end of the line. She was utterly, completely alone. And then a second gunshot cracked through the air. It wasn't a warning shot, it was a statement. The crowd flinched back, scattering like startled crows. Tessa's head snapped toward the sound. There, at the mouth of the alley, sat a tall figure on a magnificent buckskin horse, the setting sun silhouetting him like some avenging angel. "That's enough." The man's voice was low and steady, a deep rumble that carried an authority that silenced the entire mob. Even Mrs. Holloway looked momentarily stunned. "Step away from the lady." "She's no lady, Riley O'Connor," Mrs. Holloway retorted, finding her voice. "She's an outlaw, rode with Blackwell's gang. We're protecting our town." Riley O'Connor swung down from his horse in one smooth, fluid motion. His spurs chimed as his boots hit the dirt. He held his rifle loosely, but his eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, swept over the crowd, missing nothing. Tessa could see the hard line of his jaw, the dark stubble that covered it. He was a man who was used to trouble. "Seems to me," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "that 20 against 1 isn't protection. It's a lynch mob." He took a step forward, positioning himself between Tessa and the man with the rope. Last I checked, Marshall Davis is the law in Redemption Creek, not a bunch of shopkeepers with pitchforks. The marshal's 3 days out, someone yelled. Then she'll wait in a cell for 3 days, Riley replied, his voice flat. That's how justice works. Mrs. Holloway puffed out her chest. You don't know what she's done, O'Connor. The people she's hurt. I know enough about judging folks based on their worst days. Riley's gaze was cold. It swept over them all, one by one. Anyone here never made a mistake they regret? Never done something they wish they could take back? The silence was thick and heavy. Miss Kingston has been working honest at Miller's shop for months. Hasn't caused a lick of trouble. Riley turned his head just enough for Tessa to see his eyes. They were gray, like a storm building over the mountains. And they looked straight through her. I'll take responsibility for her until Marshall Davis returns. Tessa finally found her voice, raw and shaky. I don't need your charity, Mr. O'Connor. A small, grim smile touched his lips. It's not charity, Miss Kingston. It's decent behavior. Something this town seems to have forgotten today. The O'Connor Ranch may be the biggest in the county, Riley, Mrs. Holloway huffed. But that doesn't give you the right to harbor criminals. No, Riley said, his voice dropping. But the deputy badge I wear when Marshall Davis is away does. He casually brushed back his duster, and for the first time, Tessa saw the silver star pinned to his vest. A deputy. The crowd saw it too. A nervous murmur went through them. Riley's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of the revolver at his hip. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The crowd took a collective step back. Riley O'Connor had a reputation. This isn't over, Mrs. Holloway warned, but the fire had gone out of her. They began to drift away, their righteous anger deflating into sullen muttering. They weren't willing to cross a man like Riley O'Connor. When they were alone in the alley, the silence felt louder than the shouting. Tessa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, her legs feeling like they might give out. Thank you, she managed, but they'll just come back when you're gone. Riley studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then I suggest you come with me to my ranch. It's the safest place for you right now. Tessa stiffened. So I'm to be your prisoner instead of theirs? No, Miss Kingston, he said, his voice softening slightly. You'll be my guest. He gestured to his horse. Unless you'd prefer to take your chances. She looked at the empty street, at the shadowed doorways where people were still watching. She had no choice. Staying meant facing that mob again, alone. Going with this stranger, this deputy, was a risk. But it was the only risk she had left to take. I need to get my things, she said. He nodded once. I'll accompany you. The walk to her rented room above the milliner's shop was a parade of shame. Mrs. Miller, the woman who had hired her, who had treated her with a grandmother's kindness, now stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold disapproval. I trusted you, Mrs. Miller said, as Tessa packed her meager belongings. I let you into my home. I never lied about who I am now, Tessa whispered, her hands shaking. Just about who I was. It's the same thing, child, the old woman said, her voice full of sad finality. A person can't outrun their shadow. Riley, who had been waiting silently by the door, stepped forward. With respect, madam, that's where you're wrong. A shadow changes with the light. So do people, if you give them the chance. Mrs. Miller's lips thinned. Pretty words from a man who's never had to worry about his reputation. Haven't I? Riley replied, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. And there was something in his tone, a flicker of old pain, that made Tessa's head snap up. But before she could puzzle it out, he was moving, taking her bag. We'll be going. He helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. His closeness was unnerving, a solid wall of muscle at her back. His arms came around her to take the reins, and she had to force herself not to flinch. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. They rode through the center of town, a slow, deliberate procession. Every eye was on them. Tessa kept her head high, her back straight, refusing to let them see her break. 3 months of hard work, of careful living, turned to ash in a single afternoon. As they left the town behind, the vast Colorado landscape opened up, a wild, beautiful expanse of rolling hills and distant, snow-capped peaks. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "Why are you doing this?" Tessa finally asked, needing to understand. He didn't answer for a long time. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. "Because 20 years ago," he said at last, "someone did the same for me. And because whatever you did in your past, it doesn't justify a rope." "You don't know what I've done," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "But I know what it looks like when someone's trying to leave their past behind. I recognize that look in your eyes, Miss Kingston." As they rode, she studied his profile, the hard angle of his jaw, the lines around his eyes. There was a scar, thin and white, that ran from his temple down his cheek, partially hidden by his stubble. It looked old, and somehow it looked familiar. The sun was bleeding across the horizon when they finally saw it. The O'Connor Ranch. It was a fortress, a sprawling main house, and a collection of outbuildings nestled in a valley, protected on 3 sides by rising peaks. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows. It looked safe. It looked like a home. A boy of about 16, all lanky limbs and curious eyes, ran out to meet them. "Everything all right, Riley?" he asked, his gaze flicking to Tessa. "Just fine, Tommy. This is Miss Kingston. She'll be staying with us for a few days." Riley's tone was easy, casual, but his eyes were watchful. "Let Mrs. Perkins know we have a guest for dinner." Tommy nodded, his curiosity warring with good manners. He led the horse away, leaving Tessa alone on the porch with Riley. "Tommy's my ranch hand," Riley explained, opening the heavy front door. "Mrs. Perkins is my housekeeper. They're good people. They won't ask questions." The inside was solid and masculine, dominated by a huge stone fireplace and shelves filled with books. It was the home of a man who was more than just a rancher. "Mr. O'Connor," Tessa began, setting her bag down, "I need to understand what happens now. Am I your guest, or am I under arrest?" He took off his hat, revealing thick, dark hair touched with silver at the temples. He was older than she'd thought, maybe his mid-30s. "You're not under arrest. I have no warrant for you." He hung his hat on a peg. "That said, I'd appreciate your word you'll stay here until Marshal Davis returns." "And if I don't give it?" she challenged. A flicker of a smile. "Then I'd have to trust you have enough sense not to wander back into a lynch mob. But I hope you'll stay. Mrs. Perkins makes a fine stew." As if on cue, a stout woman with kind eyes and graying hair appeared. Mrs. Perkins. She wiped her hands on an apron and smiled a welcome that seemed genuine. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a calm acceptance that felt deeply unsettling after the day's events. "I'll show you to your room," Riley said. "You can freshen up." He led her up a sturdy staircase to a simple, clean room. A washstand held a pitcher of fresh water, and a handmade quilt lay folded on the bed. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. "Thank you," Tessa said, overwhelmed by the quiet civility of it all. "I don't know how to repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he said, lingering in the doorway. "While you're under my roof, your past is your own business." He left, pulling the door closed behind him. Tessa sank onto the bed, the exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. This place, this man, they were an unexpected sanctuary. A flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in years, began to kindle in her chest. Then she heard the sound. A faint, metallic click from the other side of the door. She stood up, her heart suddenly pounding. She walked to the door and turned the knob. It didn't move. She tried again, rattling it in its frame. Nothing. She was locked in. A wave of cold dread washed over her. The welcoming house, the kind housekeeper, the honorable deputy. It was all a lie. The ranch wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage. And Riley O'Connor wasn't her savior. He was her jailer. She spent the next hour in a state of quiet panic, testing the single window, which was screwed shut, and pacing the floor like a trapped animal. The hope she had felt just moments before had curdled into pure terror. What did he want? Why bring her all the way out here just to lock her in a room? Eventually, she heard footsteps approaching. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. It was Riley. He was holding a tray with a bowl of stew and a piece of bread. "Mrs. Perkins thought you might be too tired to come down for dinner," he said, his expression unreadable. Tessa stared at him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You locked me in." It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. He set the tray down on a small table. "It's a big ranch, Miss Kingston. It wouldn't be safe for you to wander around at night. For your own protection." The excuse was so thin it was insulting. "My protection? Or are you worried I'll run?" "Are you planning on it?" he asked, his gray eyes pinning her in place. The silence stretched, a battle of wills in the quiet room. She was his prisoner, but she wouldn't let him see her fear. She lifted her chin. "Give me one reason why I should stay." "Because out there," he said, gesturing toward the window and the darkening world beyond it, "you have a mob that wants to see you hang. In here, you have a locked door. You tell me which is safer." He left, and this time he didn't lock the door. The message was clear. He didn't need a lock. She was miles from anywhere, surrounded by his people, with nowhere to run. The open door was a greater show of power than the key had been. She didn't touch the stew. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house, every howl of the wind outside, sounded like a threat. She sat in a chair by the window, watching the moon rise over the jagged peaks, her mind racing. Who was Riley O'Connor? A deputy, yes, but something else, too. That scar on his face. She'd seen one like it before. The next day passed in a haze of tension. Mrs. Perkins was polite but distant, her kind eyes now seeming watchful. Tommy, the ranch hand, wouldn't look at her at all, his youthful face set in a grim, tight line. They were all in on it. They were all her guards. That evening, Riley found her on the porch. The night was cool, and the sky was filled with a spray of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "It's beautiful here," she said, testing the waters. "My father built this place," he replied, leaning against the railing. "Built it from nothing. Nearly threw it all away myself once." "What happened?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I was young. Fell in with a bad crowd, rustling cattle." He said it so easily, a simple confession. But she knew it was more than that. He was giving her a piece of his past to try and earn a piece of hers. It was a trap. Marshal Davis, just a deputy then, gave me a second chance. Taught me a man is more than his worst mistake. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Is that why you did it, Tessa? Is that why you testified against Blackwell? To get a second chance?" He used her first name. Another calculated move to disarm her. She had to play along. She had to see what he was really after. So she told him. She spun the story she'd told a dozen times before, the story that was mostly true. About being 18 and starving. About the robberies that started small and then turned bloody. About the pregnant woman on the stagecoach. the innocent life she couldn't bear to see destroyed. "I warned the driver," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The robbery failed. Jake knew he'd been betrayed. I ran that night and told the law everything." "You risked your life to save that woman," he said, his voice low and intense. He was watching her, studying her, as if trying to see the truth behind her eyes. "Couldn't live with myself if I hadn't," she whispered. He was silent for a long moment, and she could feel the trap closing around her. He was waiting for something. What had she missed? What was the lie? "You're a strong woman, Tessa Kingston," he said finally. "Stronger than anyone I've ever met. It takes a special kind of courage to burn down your own life to do the right thing. Jake never understood that kind of strength. He always said mercy was a fool's game." Tessa froze. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. "Mercy is a fool's game." It was a phrase Jake Blackwell had said 1,000 times. It was his mantra, his creed. And it was something only the men who rode closest to him would have ever heard. Riley O'Connor wasn't just a deputy who understood second chances. He hadn't just heard stories about the Blackwell gang. He had been one of them. The porch suddenly felt like the edge of a cliff. The friendly rancher, the honorable deputy. All of it was an act. A long, patient, terrifying act. He hadn't saved her from the mob. He had captured her for himself. Her mind reeled. Was he one of the gang members she'd put in prison? Had he escaped? Or was he one she'd never known about? One of the friends who had sworn revenge? "You knew him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. The friendly mask fell from Riley's face. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that terrified her more than any threat. "Knew him," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Jake Blackwell was my brother." The world tilted on its axis. Jake's brother. He had been playing with her this whole time, luring her into a false sense of security, enjoying her fear. This wasn't just about revenge for her testimony. This was personal. This was about blood. "You've been hunting me," she breathed, the realization sucking the air from her lungs. "For 2 years," he confirmed, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "Every time you settled down, I was there, in the shadows. Every time you started to feel safe, I was the one who sent the letter, the one who dropped the whisper that sent the mob to your door. I wanted you to know what it felt like, to have everything you built turn to dust, to run and have nowhere to hide." Redemption Creek hadn't been a coincidence. It had been his final destination for her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Justice," he sneered. "The kind you don't get from a judge and a jury. The kind you get from a rope and a tall tree. But first, I want you to tell me the truth. Not the pretty story you told the marshals. The real story. About what happened to that pregnant woman on the stagecoach." "I told you," Tessa insisted, her mind scrambling. "I warned the driver. She was safe." "Liar," he roared, slamming his fist on the porch rail. The sudden violence made her jump. "The robbery failed, just like you said. But that stagecoach never made it to the next town. They found it the next morning, tipped over in a ravine. The driver was dead. And so was the woman. Beaten to death." Tessa stared at him, horrified. "No, that's not possible. I saved her." "You sentenced her to death," he shot back. "My brother was many things, but he wasn't a killer of women. Someone else was there that day. Someone who got to that stagecoach after you ran. Someone who left a witness behind who described a woman fleeing the scene. A woman who looked just like you." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "There's a new wanted poster out for you, Tessa. Not for robbery, for murder." She was trapped. Utterly and completely trapped. He had orchestrated this whole thing, not just to scare her, but to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. He hadn't just been hunting her. He had been building her gallows. She had to get out. That night she didn't sleep. She waited until the house was silent, until the only sound was the ticking of a clock downstairs. She crept out of her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had to find a weapon, a horse, anything. The house was a maze of shadows. She made her way to Riley's study, the room with the books. There had to be something there. A map, a hidden gun. Her fingers scrabbled across his desk in the dark. She found a drawer, locked. She jimmied it open with a letter opener, the snap of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Inside, beneath a stack of papers, was a leather-bound journal. His journal. Her hands shaking, she opened it. The entries went back years. She scanned the pages, her eyes flying over his tight, angry script. He wrote about his brother's death, about his vow of vengeance. He wrote about tracking her, about learning her habits, her weaknesses. Then she found the entry from the day of the stagecoach robbery. Jake failed. The girl betrayed him. But the job is done. The woman is dead. Her father will finally know what it feels like to lose everything. I made it look like the girl did it, left a perfect witness. Now I just have to find her and deliver my brother's justice. He had been there. Riley had been there that day. He wasn't avenging his brother. He was covering his tracks. He was the killer. A floorboard creaked behind her. Tessa spun around, the journal clutched in her hand. Riley stood in the doorway, a lantern in his hand casting long dancing shadows on the walls. He wasn't smiling. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. She held up the journal. "You were there," she choked out. "You killed her." He didn't bother denying it. He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the journal. Jake was a fool. He wanted ransom. I wanted retribution. That woman's father, a wealthy banker, he ruined our family. Drove my father to an early grave. I wanted him to suffer. Jake's plan was too soft. You interfering gave me the chance to do it right. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The mob, Mrs. Holloway, the banker's wife. This wasn't just about Tessa's past. It was about Riley's. "You're not going anywhere," he said, taking another step. From the hallway, another voice spoke. "She's not the one you should be worried about, Riley." Marshall Davis stepped out of the shadows, a shotgun held steady in his hands. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Tommy, the young ranch hand, his face pale and set. Riley froze, his eyes wide with shock. "Marshall, what are you doing here?" "Tommy rode into town an hour ago," the marshal said, his voice grim. "Said he'd been listening at doors. Said he heard you confess to being Jake Blackwell's brother. And he heard you threaten Miss Kingston." Tommy looked at Tessa, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "My pa was the bank teller your brother killed," he said, his voice shaking. "I came to work for Riley 'cause I thought he could lead me to the rest of the gang, to get justice for my pa. But the justice he wants, it ain't right. It's just more killing." "He's a child, Marshal," Riley sneered, recovering his composure. "And she's a lying murderer. I have a witness." "You mean the witness you paid to disappear 2 years ago?" the marshal interrupted. "I've been looking for him ever since. I always knew his story didn't add up. When I heard you'd brought Tessa Kingston out here, I figured you were finally ready to make your move. I've been waiting in those hills since sundown." The trap hadn't been Riley's at all. It had been the marshal's. Suddenly, another door opened. Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, stood there, her face a mess of tears. "He told me she killed my daughter," she sobbed, looking from the marshal to Tessa. "My Sarah. She was on that stagecoach. Riley told me this woman killed her. He promised me he'd make her pay." The entire house, the entire plan, was built on a foundation of lies. Riley had manipulated them all, using their grief and their desire for revenge to build a cage for Tessa. Riley saw it was over. His eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate. He lunged, not for the marshal, but for Tessa. He grabbed her, pulling her in front of him as a shield, a knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He pressed the cold steel against her throat. "You'll let me walk out of here," he snarled at the marshal, "or she dies right now." "Don't do it, Riley," the marshal warned, the shotgun unwavering. But Riley wasn't listening. He started backing toward the door, dragging Tessa with him. This was it. After everything, after running, after fighting, she was going to die here, in this house of lies. Then, something small and hard hit Riley in the back of the head. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Tessa looked past him and saw Mrs. Perkins, her face streaked with tears, an iron poker clutched in her hand. That fraction of a second was all Tessa needed. She drove her elbow back into Riley's ribs, hard. He gasped, and she twisted, breaking his hold. She threw herself to the side as the marshal's shotgun roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Riley crumpled to the floor, the front of his shirt turning dark. The silence that followed was absolute. It was over. For real this time. In the days that followed, the whole ugly story came out. Riley O'Connor's confession, backed up by Tommy's testimony and the words in his own journal, cleared Tessa's name completely. The town of Redemption Creek was left reeling, forced to confront the fact that they had nearly lynched an innocent woman while the real monster lived among them, a wealthy rancher they had all respected. Mrs. Holloway didn't show her face in town for a week. Mrs. Perkins and Tommy, their own hearts broken by Riley's manipulation, asked for Tessa's forgiveness, which she gave without hesitation. They were victims, just as she was. The marshal gave her a choice. He could find her a place on a train, give her some money to start over somewhere new, somewhere no one had ever heard the name Tessa Kingston. Or she could stay. She walked out to the porch of the O'Connor Ranch, a place that had been her prison, and now, strangely, felt like the first place she could truly breathe. The marshal had put it under federal protection until the government could sort out who owned it. For now, it was just empty. She looked out at the mountains, standing tall and silent against the blue sky. She had spent 2 years running from her past, trying to pretend it didn't exist. But it was a part of her. It had forged her. It had made her strong. Running hadn't given her peace. Maybe staying would. She turned to the marshal. "I think I'll stay," she said, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in years. "I hear Mrs. Miller needs a good seamstress, and I think this town owes me some back pay." The past was never truly gone. But for the first time, Tessa Kingston believed it didn't have to be a shadow that followed her. It could be the solid ground beneath her feet. She wasn't running anymore. She was finally home. What do you think makes a person change? Is it a second chance, or is it the moment they decide to stop running and face the ghosts of their past? If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales from the wild heart of the world.